Hey everybody, this is Mark Amadeo. Thanks for joining us for part 3 of our vlog series covering the rights to technology under federal contracts. This vlog series is based on a white paper that we published last fall, and we're providing a link to that white paper in the vlog description. In this part, we're going to discuss 3 things that contractors need to do to preserve rights in technical data and computer software. Now for starters, let's talk about data. The government regulations over contracts with civilian agencies under FAR set out specific rules over what is called data, and data is defined as written or recorded information. Now, the way I like to think about it is that at the point where your technology becomes more than just an idea, when you start writing about it, when you write to explain it, when you write code or software to execute it, that's when your idea becomes data. So data includes testing results, schematics, drawings, source codes, and object code. Now the rules for contracts with civilian agencies under FAR, they lump technical data and software together, while the rules under DFARS for contracts with defense agencies separate technical data and computer software. Now let's talk about the government's rights. And this is all fleshed out in the white paper that we published. Now there's a general principle when it comes to how rights to technology are allocated between the government and the contractor. That principle is that there's a trade-off when a technology is developed or created on a government project with government funds. Now generally, in return for the government's role in funding the development of that technology, the government gets greater rights over what it can do with that technology. So under FARS and DFARS, for example, the government has unlimited rights over certain kinds of technical data and software that's developed under a government contract or developed exclusively with government funds. And those unlimited rights are expansive, allowing the government not just to use and disclose and distribute the technical data or software, but allowing the government to give third parties permission to do the same. Conversely, to the extent the government has little or no role in funding the development of technical data or software, the government generally has fewer rights if that data or software is then used or delivered by a contractor under a government contract. Now, depending on the contract, the particular kind of data or software, and how that data or software was developed, these fewer government rights are called restricted rights, limited rights, government purpose rights, or SBIR data rights. But to keep these restrictions on the government's rights in place, contractors should do 3 things. One thing that contractors need to do is determine as early as possible the data rights that should apply to the particular technical data or software that will be developed, used, or delivered under a government contract. Now this is where maintaining a technology inventory that we referred to in our first vlog in this series will be helpful, because it allows you to keep track of the government's rights over technology that you've already created or developed. It's important to determine early on which rights should apply to which software or data component for several reasons, and we'll mention just a few here. First, if you decide at the outset that you would rather that the government acquire limited or restricted rights over data or software that you're going to deliver, say a piece of software under a DoD contract, you may be able to limit the government's rights by funding the development yourself with private traceable funds. Secondly, by determining early on what rights apply to data or software, you're going to be in a much better position to lay the groundwork for negotiations with an agency to limit the government's rights under the default rules. Third, there are some instances in which the contractor is required to notify the contracting officer about restrictions in the government's rights before delivery of the technical data or software. And in fact, there are some circumstances in which the contractor is required to tell the contracting officer in a proposal if limited rights data is likely to be delivered. So getting a handle on the particular data and software rights early on will enable contractors to comply with these advance notice requirements. The second thing that contractors need to do is mark the data or software that's going to be delivered to the government with proper restrictive or limited rights markings. These markings are found in the FAR and DFAR's data rights clauses that are inserted into government contracts. These clauses set out the exact wording that's supposed to be used in the markings. Now, the markings put the government on notice that the contractor believes and is asserting that the government's rights in the data or software being delivered are limited or restricted. This is important for several reasons. First, as a practical matter, if you've not already had discussions about data rights with the agency, or were not required to put the government on notice in a proposal that the government's rights are expected to be limited or restricted, the markings are your chance to tell the government that you think its rights over data or software are limited or restricted. Even more importantly, if data or software is delivered without restrictive markings, the government is entitled to presume that it has unlimited rights in that data or software. Now, if you make a mistake or forget to mark the data or software, the rules allow for corrections within very specific time limits. But even in those instances, under FAR, the government assumes no liability for any disclosures or use that occurred during the time that the data or software was unmarked. So it's best to mark the data properly at the first instance. The third thing that contractors need to do is maintain adequate records and archives of the technical data and software that's developed or delivered under a government contract. Under FAR, an agency can request that the contractor provide a written justification if the agency believes a marking is unauthorized. Likewise, under DFARS, a defense agency can challenge the validity of a marking on technical data. So maintaining proper records of when technology was developed and with what funds will help with a written justification or help overcome a challenge. Otherwise, if you fail to do that, an agency can ignore or strike a marking. It's also important to maintain adequate archives of technical data or software that's developed under a government contract, not just to substantiate what rights the government may have to it, but also in case the government later decides it wants the data delivered. Now, not all technical data or software that's developed under a government contract is a deliverable, but the government may later decide, hey, we'd like to get our hands on that technical data, or we'd like to get our hands on the software that was developed, and we're willing to pay for it. In fact, in certain contracts, the government may insert a clause that gives it the right to order data 5 years after contract closing. And if that clause is inserted into a contractor is obligated to turn that data over. So to sum up, the three things that contractors need to do to preserve the rights in technical data and software are: 1, determine as early as possible the particular data rights that should apply to each data or software component that will be used or delivered. 2, place proper markings on data or software that is delivered to the government. And 3, maintain adequate records and archives of technical data or software that's developed or delivered under a government contract. Well, thanks for joining us for this episode of the GovCon video blog, and we hope you join us for future episodes.